Hi, Greg from CCC again, and we have today another example of the IELTS 1 writing test. The last time we met, we did the pie chart, which is very useful for comparing percentages either between countries or between years or other sort of comparisons. Today we're going to look at the line graph. Now the line graph is arguably the most difficult of the possible choices because it has a lot of different features and you have to be a little bit more aware of what you're doing. So here we have a graph of the births and death rates in New Zealand, and you have to comment on the useful features of these two lines. Now you can get 2 lines, you can get 4 lines, you can get very complex line graphs in which you have to group the like elements together to say something informative. And we'll probably come up with another one later on. But for the time being, we're going to do just as we did with the pie chart. We're simply going to describe what this graph is. So these two line graphs, this line graph shows the birth and death rates of New Zealand, probably annual birth and deaths, from 1901 to the present and projected into the future to 2021. So these are really annual birth and death rates. So what we're going to do here is we're going to start with the birth, then discuss the deaths, and as we do so, we'll figure the most important elements out. Now, when you get a line graph, you have to break them up usefully. So here, this part is significant because it has a certain behavior. This is also different because it shows a definite increasing trend, a very sharp rise. We have this one here which shows a broad decline, and then we have this one which shows another slightly less broad, less steep decline. So we're going to start here by saying in New Zealand in 1901, annual births stood at about 20,000. And this tended to fluctuate between up to 30,000 until about, 1939. After which time it took a sharp rise to peak at around 65,000 in about 1960, more or less. From here, it fluctuated a bit between 65 to 60, up to 63. It hit a bottom at 50,000, but recovered to 60 between 1981 and 2001. So it had a 20-year recovery. At 2001, there is a broad decline that continues into the foreseeable future. Note here that in 2041, approximately, births and deaths change. Here, deaths overtake births. So now to talk about the deaths. Annual deaths stood at about 9,000 in 1901 and fluctuated upwards until it hit about 2001. At 2001, there was a broad rising trend that peaked around 59,000 that's expected to peak at around 59,000 in 2061, after which time it will fluctuate weekly with a declining trend by 2101. So the conclusion here is that eventually, I guess right about here, we have declining birth rate. So the birth rate has been declining since about 61. The death rate has been rising. So we can expect the population of New Zealand to fall over time. And that's it. So you need to break the line graphs up into useful parts, figure what those parts are, describe them in broad terms, compare the most interesting parts, because here this is where they change in 2041. That's when births are supposed to give way to deaths. Okay, so having done that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of verbs you use in line graphs. Now you notice I said increased, rose, fell, There was a broad decline. This is the active voice, but the verbs themselves generally fall into a different category, a category you may not have heard of before. And these are called ergatives. Ergatives are a form of active verb that does not take an object. And the best way to describe this is to show a comparison of different verb forms. For example, the dog broke the vase. Well, this is active voice and it's standard structure for most sentences. The subject, verb, and the object is here, the vase. Subject, verb, object, dog broke the vase. Okay. The vase was broken by the dog. Not great English. So the vase, this is the verb, this is the object, the verb, the past participle, and this is called the agent. Okay, this is how passive voice is done. The only verb here is the verb to be. But we don't want to use that here. The vase broke. Now that's an interesting sentence because there's no object. That's a subject, that's a verb, and that's it. These are also called unaccusative verbs because there is no object. The idea behind it, and it's not a true reflexive, but the idea is that the vase broke by itself. No, it's not a true reflexive. It's not actually accurate, but it helps to think like this because this does it automatically as if you don't need to know who did it. So you would not say the vase was broke. Ugh, it had no money, I don't know. The same is true down here. The pilot landed the plane. Well, the pilot's a boring subject. Well, who else is going to land it? Space aliens? So, we don't need to know this because this is not an important subject. The plane was landed by the pilot. Well, this is also boring because, well, who else is going to land it? It's much better to say the plane landed. Now, we know the pilot did it. We don't need to say it. It's understood. So ergative expressions that don't take objects, that just have subjects and verbs, are often cleaner and more accurate. Similarly, the last one here, the sun is melting the chocolate. Okay. The chocolate is being melted by the sun. Well, this is just pointless English. The chocolate is melting. That's better. We don't need to say by what means or where the chocolate is. All that matters is that the chocolate is melting. And these are the kind of verbs that you have to use when you're describing line graphs, and pretty much anything to do with the IELTS Writing 1 assignment. You do not use the passive voice. You do not say, for example, the births in New Zealand were radically increased between 1939 and 1960. We don't talk like that. We don't want to use that. We don't want to imply that a human agent was involved with this. So we just use ergative verbs. Now I'm going to give you a little table here that shows you how to do this in one of two ways. Okay, so when you're doing IELTS 1 writing, especially line graphs, you have a choice of two methods that you can use to describe change. One of them, what we've been doing recently, is the verb plus adverb. So you can say, we'll just take the example here, which is called the price of gold. We can say it rose, climbed, went up, increased, and we have various degrees of change. We can say slightly, steadily, gradually, moderately, suddenly, rapidly, sharply, dramatically. It depends. So in the case of the birth rates of New Zealand, there was a sharp or a steep, the birth rates rose steeply, rose sharply, rose dramatically. And that would have been fine. Fluctuated is an interesting one because fluctuated means to vary within a narrow band. So you saw the first part of the births graph, where the births between 1901 and about 1939 fluctuated between 20 and 30,000 per annum. So fluctuated slightly. You can fluctuate a lot. You You fluctuate a little bit. Usually fluctuations are mild and they're small. Now you can increase, decrease, decline, dropped, went down, fell. And we can add one here, plummeted. To plummet is to go, to fall like a stone. Something that the stock market did in 1929. And later on, actually, too, throughout the 1980s. Now, verb and adverb increased dramatically, decreased steadily, peaked and plateaued. Now, peak means they hit a top, which we saw in about 1960 or so, at about 65,000. To plateau, this is a French word, and it means simply to not change anymore, to flatten out. You can plateau, you can level off, you can, well, that's all you need to say right now, to plateau or level off. Now, the alternate way to do this is to use a subject and a verb, adjective, noun. So instead of saying the price of gold increased dramatically, there was a dramatic increase in the price of gold. We can use the adjective and noun form. There is absolutely no difference between this and this. It's up to you, depending what your style is, what you want to do. Generally, this tends to be a bit wordier. It's a little more static because there was is a very, it's called the expletive structure, and it's very flat. But occasionally you want to do it for variety, or if you want to establish something as a fact. So there was a slight drop in the price of gold. There was a slight fluctuation in the price of gold. There was a plateau at some price. We don't know. So there was a plateau at, I don't know, $1,500 an ounce. So there are many different ways you can use verbs, but you notice here there's no was, except there's a was here because this is using the adjective noun form, but there's no was's here. So you can't say the price of gold was increased dramatically. Can't do that. Anyway, I'll see you next time. We'll do a different type of graph. Haven't made up my mind yet, but we'll see you next time.